When I reviewed this GEPRC SKIP HD3 recently, it occurred to me it would be an ideal quad to show how to upgrade to Betaflight 4.2. I mean, it already flies pretty well on 3.5.7, but there's some prop wash and high throttle vibrations that the RPM filtering could really help with. So, here's my complete guide to upgrading to Betaflight 4.2. I'll take you through everything you need to know about flashing the firmware, downloading and flashing the correct version of the bi-directional DSHOT firmware for the ESCs, and to do a full PID tune. Now this is a bit long, but I wanted it to be a complete tutorial with nothing left out. Hello and welcome to the Whirly Bloke channel. Before you can upgrade to Betaflight 4.2 and use the RPM filtering, there's a few things that you'll need to do. But before I get into any of that, back up your quad before you start. And I'll say it again, back up your quad before you start. And that way you can always roll back to a known working firmware version and configuration. And it could save your bacon. In fact, when I get any new plug-and-play quad, I always take a backup of the Betaflight configuration just in case. And secondly, by all means, watch all the excellent videos about flashing and setting 4.2 up. But before you do anything, have a good read of the tuning notes on the Betaflight wiki. It's full of recommended settings and tips, and it should be your Bible. And unlike even a few years ago, the default settings and tuning tips supplied by the Betaflight devs will generally make most quads fly really well, and you should only need to make a few minor tweaks. So let's get started by backing this up. Connect the quad to the PC and hit connect. Now you won't need a battery on your quad for this, just a USB connection will power the flight controller. And you can see here we're on Betaflight 3.5.7 on the Maytech 411 target. So go to the CLI tab, and to back it up just type diff all. There we go. This will display all the differences between the default Betaflight settings for 3.5.7 and whatever changes have been made on this controller. We could just use diff, but diff all shows all the differences on all the profiles, not just the one that's currently selected. You can see here we've got rate profile 1, 2, 3 and so on. Now hit save to file and put this somewhere on your PC. Now I've got a flight controller directory with a backup of all the quads and flight controllers I've worked with, and just save it with whatever name you want. But for the first backup, I just generally use the default. So to restore this, all you'd need to do is to flash version 3.5.7 on the quad and paste in the contents of that diff file into the CLI, and it'll restore everything. Okay, let's get that out of the way. Now that's all done, we can flash the latest version of Betaflight 4.2. So let's disconnect from here. So just hit update firmware, and you can see it's already selected the correct target for this, and we've got the latest version of 4.2. But if it's not selected, just pick it from the list. And we've got no reboot sequence off and full chip erase on. Okay, so load firmware online. This basically just downloads it from the Betaflight repo. And you can see here there's a summary of the release notes, which you can have a read of. And it's got links into the Betaflight wiki. So all we need to do is hit flash firmware and wait. There we go, all done. So to complete the 4.2 installation, just connect to the quad. Accept the custom defaults. I've never found these to be a problem. And then just reconnect. Now this warning just tells you the accelerometer isn't calibrated, and even if you only plan to fly acro, I'd still calibrate it. Okay, so a quick wiggle just to make sure the quad's connected. That's good. Now up here you can see that we've got Betaflight 4.2 and we're on the Maytech target, which is great. So get your quad level and reset the Z-axis to give you a bit of sense, and then hit calibrate accelerometer. There we are, that's done. Now it's important to complete these steps before trying to flash a new ESC firmware version, because you'll find the ESC pass-through doesn't work quite correctly. Now you can disconnect. Before we go any further, we need to upgrade the firmware on the ESCs to a version that supports bi-directional DSHOT. And this is needed by Betaflight to make the RPM filters work. And you can think of bi-directional DSHOT as the ESC telling the PID loop controller what it's doing, rather than the flight controller firmware having to work it out. It just saves valuable CPU time and it's more accurate. It's almost like another type of sensor. The SKIP 4-in-1 ESCs only support BL-LiS firmware, so there's an extra step we need to make. It's nothing complicated, but unless you know it, it'll really confuse you. Previously, you had to buy the bi-directional DSHOT version of BL-LiS. It's not exactly expensive, but there's a free open source version available, and this tends to be the one that lots of us use. And because these ESCs only support BL-LiS, we can use the BL-Heli configurator to flash a new version of the firmware. And this is generally easier than using BL-Heli Suite. But remember, BL-Heli configurator only works on BL-LiS. So grab a copy, I'll leave a download link in the description, and install it. And you'll need a copy of the BL-LiS firmware that supports bi-directional DSHOT. So if you head on over to the Betaflight wiki tuning notes for 4.2, you'll find a link to the DSHOT and RPM filtering page. There we go. In here you'll find a lot of useful info, plus a link to Jazz Maverick's repo, which is down here. And this is where you download the free firmware for your ESCs that supports bi-directional DSHOT. And if you check up here, there's recommendations about which version to use. And version 16.73 is the only recommended version that properly supports RPM filtering. So that's the one that we need to use. And if you look, you can download the latest BL-Heli configurator from this link as well. Now if you're upgrading a quad with a 32-bit ESC, you can skip all this because the latest BL-Heli 32 firmware supports bi-directional DSHOT anyway, and you can just use BL-Heli Suite 32 to flash the latest version. So back in BL-Heli configurator, connect your quad to your PC, and you will need a battery connected to your quad for this because the ESCs need to be powered up. And make sure you've taken the props off and there's a VTX antenna connected. And when it powers up, you'll hear the all familiar ESC startup beep sequence. Remember that. Okay, so we've got BL-Heli configurator. Connect to the quad and hit read setup. Now if you don't get anything on here, that's because you haven't gone through the full initialization of Betaflight 4.2, or you don't have a battery connected. And what you need to do is make a note of this type of the firmware that your ESC is using. In this case it's GH30 and it's version 16.7, but it's the GH30 that's important. Now head over to Jazz Maverick's repo. The link is just down here. And the Betaflight wiki recommends version 16.73, so it's this directory here. Have a look down the list of binaries to find the one that matches your ESC type. In this case it was GH30. GH30, and we need revision 16.73 as recommended by the Betaflight wiki. So if you just click that, click raw, and then right click and save it to your PC somewhere. And not a text file, it's a hex file, so we'll get rid of that. Okay, so back over to the BL-Heli configurator and select flash all. This will flash all the ESCs in one go. So if you have a look up here, you'll see it's already selected the ESC type. These are the versions that are currently available within BLHeli Configurator, and we don't want any of these. We're going to select the file manually, and we'll pick that file that we just downloaded onto our PC from Jazz Maverick's repo. Hit open, and it'll just start flashing automatically. You just need to sit and wait. So when it's finished, it will show the version that's been flashed up here, which is 16.73. But has it flashed the right version, and does it support bi-directional DSHOT? Well, a quick test is to unplug the quad and listen to the ESC startup beeps when you plug it in. Not the same as before. This means we're on the right track for setting up RPM filtering. Okay, so now the fun begins, and we need to start configuring Betaflight. Now I've connected a battery so that I can set up the receiver and the VTX. Now the fun begins, and we need to start configuring Betaflight. I've connected a battery so I can set up the receiver and the VTX. So connect to your quad again. Now you might think you can just go back to your backup diff file and simply copy and paste all your old settings into the CLI. But if you check the Betaflight wiki, you'll see there's lots of warnings about not doing this, especially if you're upgrading from an older version. Things have changed quite a bit, but you're not going to have to start from scratch. There's some things you can copy over. So I can copy in beacon, serial, these are the serial ports, LEDs, not really using those, and some aux settings. None of these gyros or PIDs or anything like that you need to copy across. So if we just copy that, paste that down here, and hit return. And we need to hit save. Oop. How about save? There we go. Quad's restarted. So if we go back into the configurator and have a look up here, we pasted in some serial ports. So we've got UART1, which is being used for IRC tramp, and UART2, which is serial RX, which we're using for S-Bus. So let's do the rest of the setup. I'm going to set the arm angle to 180, and the craft name, we'll call that SKIP 3. And let's check the receiver. So these were values that we pasted in, so the receiver mode is serial and it's on S-Bus. So that's all good. So permanent air mode I'm going to turn off, and I'll be putting that on a switch. So now we can hit save and reboot. Reconnect to the quad. So we go to the PID tuning page. This is all the Betaflight defaults with the new sliders here. I'll come back to that in a minute. So the receiver tab. Let's check these are all working. Turn my transmitter on.
Welcome to OpenTX. Disarmed. Flight mode. Angle.
All sorts of stuff going on here. But I've got throttle, I've got yaw, I've got pitch, and I've got roll. Okay, so let's go, and I'll set up the RSSI channel, which we can see here is on aux 12. So hit save. That beeping will stop in a minute. It's going into modes, so I'm going to set the arm switch on aux 1. Save. Angle I've got on aux 2, and horizon is also on aux 2.
Flight mode, horizon, flight mode, angle, flight mode, horizon, flight mode.
Beeper I've got on aux 3, so let's put that up there. Good. Beeper's working.
Flight mode, horizon.
Angle and horizon are working. Air mode I'm going to switch on when I'm in acro mode. There we go.
Flight mode, angle.
And I'll just set turtle. Flip over after crash, and I've got that
Turtle mode activated.
aux 5. Save. So we've got arm switch working,
Disarmed.
angle,
Flight mode.
horizon,
Flight mode. Acro.
and air mode,
Flight mode. Angle. Turtle mode activated.
and we've got turtle mode. So that's all that set up. Hit save. Now Betaflight 4.2 has a fancy VTX mapping, which is great because it means you can exactly match the OSD with your VTX channels and power settings. Now you could set all this up by hand, but if you go to this page up here, so in here there's some files that you can use, which means you don't have to type all that stuff in. So we are using IRC Tramp. Now, although I'm in the EU, I know that if I use the EU version, it will restrict power settings and channels. So I'm going to go for IRC Tramp. Right click, save link as, and we'll put that in the same place as we got everything else. So now we can say load from file in Betaflight, select that JSON file that we just downloaded, and lo and behold, it's configured all our channels for us. But on the VTX that we're using, we've only got 3 power settings. All these channels will be fine, so we can reduce that down to 3. And the levels that we've got are 25, 100 and 200. You could change these to be whatever you like. So those are the values it sets, and this is the label that will appear in your OSD. So I'm going to set the default, which for me is raceband 3. Power setting 200. So that means that when I hit save, that's the default setting that I will get. So that's everything that I need to do to get Betaflight 4.2 set up so it will fly. But let's get on to enabling the RPM filters. So on the config page, turn bi-directional DSHOT on and carefully count the number of magnets on your motor bell. For these 1105s it's 12, but for a typical 5-inch it's going to be 14. Check them carefully though, because if you get it wrong, the filtering won't work. Okay, let's hit save. In the Betaflight wiki, there's a whole section on setting up the RPM filtering, which has got all the info you need, including a whole load of presets for different types of flying. So back in Betaflight, let's go to configuration. Now you can't change the gyro frequency any longer, that's set automatically. And the recommended PID loop frequency for best reliability is 4K with DSHOT 300. So I'm going to set that. So all this information comes from the Betaflight wiki. Don't forget to save and reboot. So you can reconnect, go to the motors tab, give the motors a bit of a spin, and check this packet error down here is 1% or less, preferably 0. If not, then you probably set something wrong, so go back and double check. So that's the RPM filters done, pretty much it. Very straightforward. Now fortunately, unlike the good old days, or bad old days, the defaults provided by Betaflight for the PIDs is pretty good, and it means that most quads will fly really well. So the first thing to do is give them a go and see how it flies. But there's a few tweaks that you can make before you start. Again, these are recommendations in the wiki. So leave all these sliders in their default positions and turn D-min off. D-min is simply the value of the D term the flight controller uses when you're just cruising around and not making fast aggressive moves. When the D term is needed, it uses the PID value that's set up here. And this feature means you can wind up the D term to reduce the set point overshoot or bounce back without the motors working too hard and getting hot. And in some ways you can think of D term as a braking effect. As the motor tries to keep up with rapid stick movements or set points, the D term rapidly brakes the overshoot and the motors get hot. If it's full on all the time, the motors can just get hot with small stick movements. So D-min just backs off how aggressive the brakes are until they're needed. But weirdly, my recommendation is to turn D-min off and only turn it on when you find yourself having to crank up the D term really high and the motors are getting very hot. When you're doing your initial tune, it's a bit of a muddle factor, so just turn it off and don't forget to hit save. Okay, onto the filters tab. On the filter settings tab, just use the default settings on these sliders for your first flight. But the dynamic notch filter has some recommended changes. Again, these are from the wiki. Set the dynamic notch width to 0 and the Q to 120 and the notch frequency between 90 and 350. These are equivalent to low in the previous versions of Betaflight 4, which I know work great on this quad. And again, hit save. So that's all good to go. So let's have a look at the rates. The rate profile 1, I'll just set my defaults, which work quite well for me. So this gives me 1000 degrees per second on roll and pitch and a little bit slower on yaw, which I quite like. So I'm going to hit save for that. Now in Betaflight 4.2 there's some different rates, actual. Yes. Now I found after a bit of experimentation on another quad that the settings that seem to be quite good are these. As you can see, we've got a fairly flat profile. We're still on 1000 degrees per second. Let me just save that. Okay, so that's all I'm going to set for the first tuning flight. So I'm trying to tune this on 3S first because I want to compare the 3S and 4S performance of the Skip. On Betaflight 3.5.7 there was some high throttle vibrations and a bit of wash on 3 and 4S. Now unfortunately there's no black box on the Skip, so it's going to have to be all done by feel. So just try a load of single axis manoeuvres, throttle steps and quick roll and pitch steps on each axis, and look for bounce back and wobble, and make sure it responds to stick inputs nicely. Try some split S's and 180 degree turns to see if there's any prop wash. And try flying with your hands off the sticks to see how well it tracks, which is good in the wind actually, and this checks the I turn. Keep your flight short and check the motors when you get back. They should be warm, but not so hot that you can't keep your fingers on them for 15 seconds or longer. Now this flew pretty well on 3S with the values that I've set, with no real sign of prop wash or high throttle vibrations. But when I looked at the HD footage, there was lots of high frequency vibration, particularly on high throttle, which was weird because it actually felt fine. But after a nose round on the quad, I found one of the side plastic screws had broken off in the standoff and the canopy just wasn't as stiff as I remembered it. So I replaced the plastic bolts with some hex cap ones and a couple of washers and went out for another try. So now let's try tuning this on 4S. Now I'm not going to go through the whole process, but I found the best way to tune Betaflight 4.2 is using the PID and the filter sliders. These guys here. I don't go for 100% tune and spend ages chasing that last little bit performance. I'd rather get it where it feels right as quickly as I can so that I can go out flying, and I'd rather be flying than tuning. Anyhow, I tend to reduce the filtering using the sliders. Just reduce the gyro and the D-term filter multipliers bit by bit and take it out for a fly. Fly the same manoeuvres each time to minimise confusion and try not to mix axes. Just do single axis manoeuvres. Do roll on its own, then pitch on its own and so on. As you wind the filtering down, I know we're moving these up, but it's saying less filtering. Keep an eye on the motors. Make sure they're not getting too hot and they're not sounding all angry and horrible when you arm and take off. If they do, you're near the limit, so just back them off a bit. Also, make sure you've got expert mode turned on, because that limits how far you can wind this up here. For tuning this, I found that actually the Skip works really well with the filtering turned almost all the way off. So that's where I ended up. Now if we go back and look at the PIDs, if you want a snappier response, try increasing the stick response gain. Again, take it in steps. This adds more feed forward, and in fact, give each slider a tweak and try it. And I bet in most cases the defaults I've shown you are a pretty good compromise. But just take small steps and watch the motor temperatures. So these are the settings I ended up with on the Skip, and on 4S it flies beautifully. There's a minute bit of wash on very, very hard 180-degree turns, but I really can't be bothered to spend ages getting rid of it. I'm not sure it's even possible, to be honest. And I'll leave a download link to my final diff file if you want to see the tune in more detail. And on these settings on 3S, it's faultless. If you check out the flight footage link in the description and the end screen, you'll see what awesome fun this little SKIP HD3 is on 4S and Betaflight 4.2. It's the toothpick that flies most like a 5-inch. As always, thanks for watching, and if you found that useful, give me a thumbs up and leave a comment. And if it's your first visit, then please do the subscribe-y belly thing up here to get notified when I post new content. I'll see you next time.